It was an ordinary Wednesday night in mid-October when Malcolm Reed was still in his office on the 17th floor of the Reed Logistics headquarters. Most of the employees had already left, but he, as always, remained immersed in spreadsheets, reports, and future goals. At 52, Malcolm was the very picture of a disciplined businessman, a man who woke up every day at 5 a.m., maintained a timed routine, and believed that success was a simple equation: effort multiplied by consistency. Owner of a company, valued in the millions, he used to say that one could succeed in life with hard work and focus, and he truly believed it. His days were meticulously planned, and even his interpersonal relationships within the company were strictly professional. Malcolm did not acknowledge employees' birthdays, nor did he get involved in HR meetings. To him, justice was about paying well and demanding performance, nothing more. That night, however, something broke the predictability of his daily routine. When he got up to fetch a coffee in the small break room next to the hallway, Malcolm noticed an unusual movement. Naomi Hayes, one of the most punctual and reserved administrative analysts in the company, was hurrying through the back of the cafeteria. She didn't see him. She was distracted, tense, almost hidden. He watched, curious, as she discreetly received a small container of food from the hands of a kitchen staff member and stowed it in her bag, glancing around as if she were committing a crime. This stirred within him an unnameable discomfort. Why would someone who earned above-average wages, regularly worked overtime, and had impeccable performance feel the need to take food hidden away? Malcolm, not exactly knowing what was driving him, decided to follow her, not as a boss seeking punishment, but as someone who, for the first time, felt there was something there that the reports could never show. Malcolm had never followed anyone in his life. He was a man of straight trajectories, of predictable paths, who trusted systems and despised any kind of emotional impulse. But that night, something inside him broke that pattern. He kept a safe distance, silently taking the service elevator and watching Naomi leave through the side entrance with hurried steps. She was wearing the same navy blue blazer she wore every day, already worn at the sleeves, but still maintained an upright, almost rigid posture. She walked about 4 blocks to an old building, one of those with exposed bricks and rusty railings where the faded paint seemed to carry decades of untold stories. Malcolm hesitated to cross the street, but he went to the opposite sidewalk where he could observe her without being noticed. She carefully opened the gate, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and entered one of the back apartments. From the slightly open window, the yellowish light of a weak lamp revealed a cramped, almost empty space. And then, for the first time, Malcolm saw Naomi's children, 2 small kids with thin faces and attentive eyes, who ran to the door as soon as they saw her enter. She knelt on the floor, took the pot from her bag and hastily opened it, dividing the contents between 2 chipped plates. They ate with an unsettling speed, as if unsure when they would have another full meal, and that hit him like a silent punch in the stomach. Malcolm couldn't move for several minutes. He stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed and eyes fixed on that window. He felt his body present, but his mind seemed to detach from reality, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Naomi, the exemplary employee, the one who never complained, who always said, "All right, sir," with a slight discreet smile, lived in conditions he could never have imagined. And the most disconcerting part was realizing that this was not a coincidence, not an isolated failure in the system. It was the system. The very system he had built with so much pride, based on the idea that those who work hard always achieve. But Naomi worked hard every day, more than most, and yet her children ate leftovers. That night, he went home without turning on his car radio, without answering any of the calls that came to his cell phone. When he reached his penthouse where he lived alone, he looked around and saw the stark contrast between his life and that of the woman who, until hours before, was just a name on a productivity spreadsheet. That night did not end like all the others. For the first time in many years, Malcolm Reed lost sleep. The next day, Malcolm arrived at the office earlier than usual, but he couldn't face his routine in the same way. Everything seemed off. The coffee he always drank upon arrival, the sound of keyboards in the background, even the formal greetings from the employees sounded too mechanical. For the first time, he felt he had no idea who these people were whom he passed by every day. And among them, Naomi's face was the only one he saw clearly, not as just another employee, but as a woman who would return home at night with the same silent haste and the same tired eyes. He spent the morning rereading the company's benefits contracts, analyzing salary spreadsheets, reviewing internal policies that he himself had approved years ago with full conviction. But now, with a different outlook, everything seemed cold, insufficient. Numbers that once represented above the market average now carried a moral weight. He tried to focus on other tasks, but his stomach felt tied in. Knots and the image of Naomi's children devouring that pot of food haunted him more than he admitted. In the early afternoon, Malcolm called Naomi into his office. She entered with the same discreet posture as always, holding a lined notebook in her hands and waiting for orders. "Please have a seat, Naomi," he said in a lower voice than usual. She obeyed, not quite understanding the reason for the summons. He hesitated for a few seconds, searching for the right words. He didn't want to embarrass her, nor treat her as a social case, but he could no longer pretend he didn't know. "I wanted to ask you something," he began, but stopped mid-sentence. Naomi looked up, surprised. It was rare for him to show any kind of personal interest. "Are you all right?" he finally asked. The question hung in the air like a strange, almost uncomfortable echo. She furrowed her brows slightly, trying to interpret it. "Yes, sir. Everything's fine." But Malcolm knew it wasn't, and that "everything's fine" was the same he heard every day, only now loaded with a weight he had previously been unable to perceive. Malcolm took a deep breath, resting his elbows on the desk. He didn't want to pressure her, but he couldn't ignore everything he had witnessed. "Last night, I saw you leaving the company. I saw you taking food." The silence that followed was almost cruel. Naomi paused for several seconds, motionless, as if time had frozen around her. Then she lowered her eyes, embarrassed. He noticed how her fingers tightened around the notebook, as if seeking protection. "I'm sorry, sir. I never did it to take advantage. It's just that sometimes there's leftover food and—" Her voice faltered, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I only take what was going to be thrown away. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." That justification, which she had rehearsed so many times in her mind, now sounded so small in the face of the reality he already knew. Malcolm shook his head slowly. "I'm not here to reprimand you, Naomi. I didn't know." And that confession, spoken in an almost whispered tone, exposed him more than he had expected. Naomi remained silent, still wary, still not understanding the true reason behind this dialogue. Then Malcolm stood up and walked over to the window, trying to organize his thoughts. "I built this company believing that if I paid well and demanded performance with fairness, everything would be all right, that everyone would do their part and live with dignity." He turned to her with a look that was no longer that of a boss, but of someone in conflict. "But last night, seeing your children, I realized that it's not enough to pay what the market deems fair." Naomi became even more confused. She wasn't used to seeing him hesitate, express doubts, show his human side. "You shouldn't have to hide food. No one should." For a few seconds, she just stared at him, not knowing what to say. And for the first time since she had joined Reed Logistics, she felt that she was truly being seen, not as a number, not as a function, but as a person. The conversation did not last much longer. Naomi thanked him, a little awkwardly, and left the room with measured steps, still trying to understand what that all meant. Malcolm remained alone, watching the closed door for a few seconds, as if expecting something more to happen. But nothing happened, only silence. For the rest of the day, he barely managed to concentrate on his usual tasks. He cancelled 2 meetings, ignored a call from investors, and spent most of his time sifting through old company files, internal policy documents, and performance evaluation reports. He was trying to understand when everything had become so detached from the reality of the employees. He reviewed benefits that hadn't been adjusted in years, aids that looked good on paper but made no practical difference. He began to realize that the world outside was very different from the bubble he lived in, and that even with good intentions, he was too far removed to see what really mattered. In the following days, Malcolm started moving around the company's corridors more, something he rarely did. He began to notice details that had previously been invisible. Employees with worn-out shoes, exhausted looks, hushed conversations about debts, care for sick children, shared rides to save on transportation costs. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. That structure he once thought so solid now seemed full of cracks, small, silent, but real, and they all began to bother him. He gathered the directors and presented an initial proposal. He wanted to review the pay policy, expand benefits, create an emergency fund for employees in vulnerable situations. The reaction was immediate. Skeptical looks, discomfort, technical speeches about impact on margins, and the risk of setting a precedent. With all due respect, Malcolm, this isn't sustainable. The company already offers above average conditions, one of the directors said, trying to close the discussion. But he did not back down. For the first time, he was not interested in spreadsheet justifications. He was interested in people. That same week, Malcolm convened a new meeting, this time only with the Human Resources Department. He requested a detailed survey of the employees' realities. How many had small children? How many lived far away? How many needed to work overtime to make ends meet? He wanted to understand the profile of each department, which positions received the minimum allowed, and which benefits were actually used. As the data began to emerge, the indignation grew inside him. There were stories that no one had ever told. A cleaning assistant who sold sweets on the bus to supplement her income. An intern who slept at friends' houses because he couldn't pay rent. A pregnant employee who left her child with neighbors in order to work overtime. And all this was happening under the roof of the company he had built, which he proudly called fair. It was like facing a cracked mirror. He began to question every decision he had made over the years, every goal, every cut that seemed small on paper, but had a real consequence in someone's life. It was at that point that Malcolm decided to go beyond meetings. He resolved to visit personally the operational sectors, a thing he hadn't done since the early years of the company. He roamed through the warehouse, accompanied the routine of the drivers, entered the cramped room where the assistants controlled the routes, had lunch in the cafeteria with the employees. At first, everyone found it strange. Some even thought it was a surprise audit. But gradually, he began to get closer. He asked how they were doing, listened to small everyday stories, observed everything with genuine attention. And the more he listened, the more he understood the vast chasm between what he thought he knew and what was actually happening. He realized that many avoided speaking openly, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of habit. But even the silences said a lot. There was an entire universe of neglected needs, and Malcolm, for the first time, was willing to listen with real eyes and ears. Internal resistance, however, began to grow. Some old executives started whispering behind his back that Malcolm was too emotional, that this was just a phase, a passing outburst caused by personal weariness. There were even discreet suggestions that he take a vacation, but he did not back down. He created a task force within the company to restructure benefits based on the real needs of the employees, no longer using market benchmarks. He asked the HR team to develop a plan for daycare assistance, subsidized transportation, and psychological support programs. He also demanded that the budget be reviewed. He wanted to cut executive bonuses, including his own, to reallocate resources where they would truly make a difference. The discomfort was immediate. It challenged old privileges and put the entire power structure of the company into question. But Malcolm was determined. For the first time, he was not acting thinking of financial return or corporate image. He acted out of conviction, and that for him was something new. During one of the meetings with the finance committee, one of the board members confronted him directly. "Do you want to turn Reed Logistics into an NGO, Malcolm? This is a company, not a social assistance center." He listened in silence. He did not respond immediately. He simply stared at the man for a few seconds and then said, with a calm that no one expected, "No, I want to turn this place into a place where people don't have to hide food in their bags to feed their children." The room fell silent. Some averted their gaze, others furrowed their brows, clearly uncomfortable. But no one responded. That sentence hung in the air like a turning point. Malcolm knew he was picking a big fight, perhaps the biggest, of his business life. But he no longer cared. The discomfort of others was nothing compared to the discomfort he felt when he remembered the hungry eyes of Naomi's children. And that discomfort was what kept him firm. Some changes began to be implemented. Even amid resistance, the daycare assistance was approved, with priority for single mothers and vulnerable families. A complimentary food program was created to ensure that all employees could take food home without shame, without having to hide it. And gradually, something began to change in the corridors of the company. The atmosphere became less tense, the glances livelier, the conversations more relaxed. It still wasn't ideal. Malcolm knew that, but it was a start. He began to speak more frequently with the employees, to ask how they were really doing, to remember names, to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. He even began a routine of visiting different sectors each week, not as an inspecting boss, but as someone who wanted to see the real impact of the decisions made. It was as if he were relearning how to be a leader. And in that process, he was also rediscovering himself. One afternoon, after leaving a meeting with the logistics team, Malcolm ran into Naomi in the corridor. She was holding a folder in her hands and seemed surprised to see him there, so casually, outside his office. He smiled and nodded, greeting her naturally. She returned the gesture, still with a hint of shyness, but with a different sparkle in her eyes. A few days later, she went to his office on her own accord. She wanted to thank him for the changes, but also to share something. "My children have started sleeping better. It may sound silly, but now they have a proper dinner, and that changes everything." Malcolm listened in silence, with a tightness in his chest that was hard to explain. She smiled, moved, and added, "I know there's still a lot to be done, but just knowing that we matter makes a difference." And there, in that simple and sincere moment, he was sure he was on the right path, because it wasn't just about salaries or benefits, it was about dignity. The changes promoted by Malcolm began to spread beyond the walls of Reed Logistics. Other companies in the sector started to notice the internal adjustments and, even if with reservations, began discussing new policies for caring for their employees. The local press published an article about Reed's reformation, highlighting the support programs and the drop in the number of medical leaves due to stress in just 3 months. One of the reporters asked Malcolm during an interview what had motivated him to transform management. He took a deep breath, thought of Naomi, thought of her children, and replied simply, "Because it's impossible to sleep well when you discover that someone in your company is going hungry." The repercussion was immediate. For some, it was a commendable gesture. For others, pure marketing. But he no longer cared about what they said. He was more interested in what he felt while walking the corridors and seeing lighter, less tense faces. He knew there was still much to be done, but now there was a new foundation: listening, empathy, and action. On one of the following mornings, Malcolm arrived at the company and found a note on his desk. It was handwritten in a delicate yet firm script. "Thank you for seeing us, for not treating our problems as mere numbers, for remembering that we are still human. Cafeteria. Team. He held that paper for several minutes, feeling the symbolic weight it carried. It wasn't about personal recognition, but about breaking a cycle. For the first time in years, he felt that he had managed to touch something beyond the reports. He had touched lives, and more than that, he was being touched by them as well. The transformation that had started with Naomi was no longer just hers, nor just his. It was a collective, silent movement that began to reconfigure the culture of an entire organization. And Malcolm, that same man who once believed that everything was solved with effort and merit, now knew that dignity should never depend solely on that. Over time, the employees themselves began to suggest improvements. A group of drivers proposed the creation of a restroom equipped with armchairs and showers for the days they spent hours on the road. The administrative assistants requested a collaborative library with books that could be shared among everyone. Ideas that before would have been ignored or seen as secondary were now discussed in meetings, taken seriously, considered part of building a new business model. Malcolm, upon noticing this spontaneous movement, realized that there was something even more valuable than any strategic plan: belonging. And it was this feeling that he began to nurture day after day, with small actions that, added together, transformed not only the work environment, but also the way people related to the company. For the first time, the corridors of Reed were not just passages between departments. They were living spaces where genuine bonds were built. Even so, not everything was easy. Some old leaders, accustomed to the old rigidity, left their positions because they couldn't adapt to the new proposal. More conservative investors pressed for cuts, arguing that social expenses were excessive. Malcolm listened to it all, pondered, but did not give in. He stated firmly, in one of the most tense meetings of the board, "If my profit depends on the misery of those who work with me, then I'd rather earn less." It was a shock. Many did not expect that attitude from him, the businessman known for his analytical coldness. But it was exactly that contrast that gave weight to his words. He had once been that pragmatic, distant man, shielded by graphs and goals. Now he was different. A man who had discovered, in the most painful way possible, that no spreadsheet reveals the hunger of a child, and that no profit margin is worth the silence of someone who suffers in silence. A few weeks later, Malcolm received an invitation to speak at a local university about humanized business management. At first, he thought about declining. He had never felt comfortable speaking in public about emotions, especially in an academic setting. But something inside him said he needed to accept, not for self-promotion, but because if he, the man who had always been a symbol of rigidity and distance, could change, then others could too. In the packed auditorium, he took the stage with cold hands and a dry throat. He began by recounting his journey, how he built Reed Logistics on the basis of effort and discipline, and how he had believed until not long ago that that was enough. Then he spoke about Naomi. He did not use full names nor expose intimate details, but shared the essential, how a small, almost unnoticed gesture was capable of toppling an entire castle of certainties, and how that fall forced him to rebuild, brick by brick, a new way of leading. At the end of the lecture, a student approached him, young, with braided hair and attentive eyes. She said that her story wasn't a question, but a thank you. "My father works at a transport company. He comes home exhausted every day, earns little, and was never heard. I just wish his boss had the courage you had." Malcolm swallowed hard. He couldn't respond immediately. He simply nodded with a discreet smile, feeling the impact of that sentence, echoing within him, that confirmed once again that the changes he had been promoting were not just an internal repair, but a reflection that could spread beyond his company. And he, who for years had shielded himself against everything unmeasurable, now felt guided by something far more powerful than numbers: conscience. The conscience that leading people is, above all, being willing to really look at them. At the Reed Logistics headquarters, the effects of that transformation began to be felt on subtle yet profound levels. Teams started working with more autonomy, more dialogue, more purpose. It wasn't just about having better conditions, it was about being heard, considered, respected. The results also began to appear in the numbers, though that was never Malcolm's main focus again. Turnover dropped drastically, the number of absences reduced, and the organizational climate reached levels that previously seemed unattainable. But above all, he noticed changes that couldn't be captured by graphs. People greeting each other more lightly, sharing stories over coffee, smiling as they passed in the corridors. The place had come to life. And Malcolm, who for decades believed that empathy was a luxury, now understood that it was a structural necessity, not because it made the environment more pleasant, but because it dignified work, and dignifying work was, ultimately, dignifying life. One night, once back to his quieter routine, Malcolm passed again by the building where Naomi lived. It was just a walk home, with no specific intention, but his eyes instinctively searched for the lit window. He saw a small new curtain, some plants on the balcony, and felt a strange peace in his chest. He didn't need to know all the details to understand that life there was a little better. That discreet woman had been the spark for a turnaround he could never have foreseen. And ironically, that saved him too. It saved him from indifference, from the coldness of numbers, from the dangerous comfort of those who believe they do enough just because they pay a salary. That night, he went home in silence, just as the first time he had seen Naomi's reality. But now, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence full of meaning, of understanding, a silence that for the first time in a long time brought peace. In the following months, Malcolm decided to implement an active listening program within Reed Logistics. He created fixed spaces where small groups of employees could share suggestions, difficulties, and experiences directly with leadership without hierarchical filters. He himself made a point of participating in some of these meetings, without a tie, without an imposing posture, just as someone who wanted to learn. And there he heard stories that would never have reached him by email or report. He discovered talents that were hidden behind underestimated roles, learned about problems that could be solved with simple adjustments, and witnessed bonds being strengthened among teams that barely knew each other before. Gradually, the company ceased to be just a production cog and became a living, pulsating human organism. And, at the center of it all, was the awareness he had acquired on that silent October night, a turning point that continued to reverberate, transforming not only the company's culture, but the very meaning of being a leader. Malcolm was still demanding. He still enforced deadlines, goals, and organization. But now he did so with a different gaze. A gaze that sought balance, that understood contexts, that saw beyond the title. He realized that true leadership was not about being feared nor being idolized, but about being fair and, above all, present. Sometimes he still caught himself remembering that pot of food hastily stowed away in Naomi's bag. It was a small, almost trivial detail, but one that carried the force of a silent revolution. And perhaps, for that reason, he never tried to forget that scene, because it was precisely that which woke him up, that which made him cross the street, literally and symbolically, and see what had always been right in front of his eyes. And deep down, that was what he hoped every person in the company would learn from him, that dignity is not a bonus, it's a foundation, and that no goal is worth more than the respect for those who build it. Sometime later, during an end-of-year company celebration, Malcolm took the small improvised stage in the cafeteria to say a few words. It wasn't the kind of event in which he usually spoke. Previously, he preferred that speeches be left to the managers, but that year, everything had been different. With the microphone in hand and the sound of cutlery still echoing in the background, he looked at the faces watching him intently and said without adornment, I have learned more from you in the past few months than in all the years I have led this company. I have learned that working hard is not always enough. I have learned that listening is as important as leading, and above all, I have learned that no company survives without taking care of the people who support it. There was a brief silence before the applause began, and at that moment, he was no longer the unattainable boss from the 17th floor. He was simply Malcolm, a man who had changed and who now made a point of walking alongside others. After the party, Naomi approached him to say goodbye. She was with her children, who had been invited for the first time to a company event. The little one ran up to Malcolm and hugged him spontaneously. He bent down and returned the gesture, smiling genuinely. Naomi, with teary eyes, simply said, "Thank you for everything." He shook his head, moved. "I'm the one who should thank you. You taught me what no spreadsheet ever showed, and it was there, amid laughter, casual conversations, and children playing between the tables, that Malcolm was sure his company was different, but he was even more so. And if, before he believed that everything was summarized by hard work and results, now he knew that true results are measured by the impact we leave on people's lives. And that, definitely, was his greatest achievement. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and found it helpful, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, give the video a thumbs up, and share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got lots of exciting content coming your way. Your support truly means the world to us and helps us create even better videos for you. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.